there was this sense of feeling like I was just falling apart, like something was crumbling within me. And the not knowing anything, the uncertainty about anything, felt like the opposite. It really felt like facing death. This was hell, from the point of identity that thrives on feeling special, noble, better than the people it judges. This was hell. The truths, albeit incredibly uncomfortable about myself, was way more liberating than continuing to live a lie, The nobodiness that I'm talking about, I don't mean like, oh, I'm nobody, as in like a new identity, I'm nobody, I'm nothing special. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the nobodiness that says I don't exist. I don't exist. Hi everyone. Before I start, I just want to say welcome to new subscribers. Thanks so much for joining me in conversations and explorations about all things non-duality, the awakening process, and our full-blown humanness, because at least here on this channel, none of those things are seen as separate. And if you do enjoy the videos, please make sure to always remember to like and to comment and to share what resonates with you and why. It's always very much appreciated. And also, it really does help support the channel, and it helps the channel be more findable and visible to people who might be looking for these kinds of conversations that we're having here. So today's topic is not exactly a light one. Today's topic is really death, or the deaths that are part of the awakening process. And I put a little trigger warning in the description, in the title, because not to be dramatic, honestly, or not to scare anyone. We're at different stages in this journey. And so while talking about the kind of deaths that I'm going to be talking about, may be really interesting and even fascinating, and people may be totally open to hearing it. For some people, to hear about these things can feel a bit scary, or maybe even scary a lot, or just like unsettling, right? So basically what I'm trying to say is that if you feel like a bit wobbly and you feel like you just don't have it in you to go there and to listen to this particular, to listen to me talk about this particular topic, then that's totally fine. You can go back to it later, or to even not listen to it ever. That's totally fine. So as always, I'm going to be talking about the kind of deaths that I experienced in my journey. The reason why I'm talking about my own experience is really because that's the only thing I can really talk about. That's the only thing I know. I'm not here to say, and therefore this is how it is, and therefore this is how it has to be for everyone. I honestly don't know how it has to be for everyone. So once again, I'm going to use my own experiences to talk about the deaths and the different kind of deaths that I've been through. When I look at the journey I've been on, it feels like a lot of it many times felt like a process of dying, like falling apart. And if we take the first awakening as the beginning of this process, then that took place over 10 years ago. I didn't even call it an awakening at the time. I used to call it a fundamental shift in perception, because that's what it felt like. And I talked about it a lot, so I'm already in different videos and in some of the interviews, so I'm not going to go into details about that. But the one thing that I want to mention about this first awakening was just really seeing myself beyond just my identity, and not just seeing beyond my identity, but seeing into the sort of ephemeral, almost intangible nature of identity. That basically nothing that I thought of myself or about myself, any story, any belief no longer looked solid, no longer looked like fact, which is which was the case before that first shift. And it was also an insight into just the very nature of thought and its transient nature. And this was an incredibly freeing and liberating experience, and like, some kind of burden that I didn't even know I carried all my life dropped in a split second, and just everything looked different. And so what followed was like a really long period of what I can describe as equanimity, just really no suffering, or very little anyway. It doesn't mean there were no problems or anything like that. There were also there were all sorts of problems as far as my personal life that went on at the time, but the sense of liberation and seeing even all those problems was just so different to what it was before. And life felt, despite those challenges, despite certain challenging circumstances, as a rather smooth ride, so to speak. And then after about 3 years, I plunged back into suffering. And if you're interested in this particular topic, the topic of suffering and whether awakening and suffering, my recent video was about that. So again, I'm not going to go into details. But basically, the confusion that I experienced at the time and the way I felt after such a profound shift and after such a long period of living in that equanimity, the confusion and the shock of what was happening with me now was just incredible. If I were to try to describe it in a nutshell, which if you have been watching my videos, that for me to describe anything in a nutshell is almost impossible. It often felt like I was dying, quite honestly, or at the very least, I didn't want to live anymore and be human and deal with all things life. But above all, it was an incredibly confusing experience and very unsettling, very scary, because all of a sudden I went from sort of certainty about who I was in terms of my identity, what I wanted from life, what I wanted to do in life, but even who I was as a person, to all of a sudden not knowing at all, not knowing at all. And this was incredibly unsettling. There was this sense of feeling like I was just falling apart, like something was crumbling within me. And I had no idea what that was or what that meant. But if we're talking about in the context of deaths, that really often felt like I was just dying, like I was falling apart. And there was this split between what was realized, let's say the formless, and then the form, and the two looked like they couldn't be reconciled. Odds, which is why for a long time, I felt like I lived in between, like neither here nor there. And that was really unsettling. That went for quite a few years, again, on and off. The most kind of scary part of this process was really the unknown, yet trying to know something with certainty. So it was almost like the uncertainty, which felt to me like this black void, basically, just really felt terrifying. Unknowingly, I was just doing everything I could to basically run away from it. I had no frame of reference. I didn't know anything about awakening. I didn't know anything about stages of awakening. There was no Angelo there or any teacher that would see me at the time and say, okay, this is where you're at, this is what's going on, this is what you need to do. And above all, that this is very much part of the awakening process. And they would be absolutely right. I just didn't know that. I didn't realize that seeing ourselves beyond the identity whether it's through the experience of no separation or no self or whatever. Really, if that's our first insight, our first shift, it's really just a beginning. Because if you imagine the identity or a separate self as a sort of a structure that's held together by various beliefs and imprints and stories, then really seeing through it, or seeing that this is just, there's no solidity to it, it really is just the beginning of that whole structure collapsing and being dismantled. Now, looking back, I know that process had only begun with the first awakening. And it only hit me after about 3 years after the first awakening. But because I didn't have any frame of reference, that's why I found it incredibly confusing and incredibly scary. And I just had no idea how much this identity almost exists based on what it knows for sure. It's almost like to know something for sure is to exist. Whereas the not knowing anything, the uncertainty about anything, felt like the opposite. It really felt like facing death. But as I said, this uncertainty, this black void was emerging to be met. But it wasn't, because it was obviously so terrifying, and it was the last thing I would want to do. So this went on and off for several years. And then I experienced what I basically used to call an emotional breakdown later on. And in the book, I call it the surrender. Soon after that, I plunged back into what I referred to in the book as the darkest night. The reason why I call it the darkest night is because I've been going through several dark nights from the between the first awakening and the emotional breakdown multiple times. And the reason why I referred to this darkest night as the darkest one is because it was excruciatingly painful process. It was like sitting through or sitting in the middle of a fire. And I sometimes call it a fire of truth, because any belief, anything I was used to seeing myself as, anything I believed I was, and even more specifically, I wasn't, was being exposed as a lie. So from the point of view of the identity, which didn't see those things as beliefs, but as facts, and that were never questioned, it was absolutely devastating. The identity especially thrived on feeling different, on feeling special in some way, on needing to feel special, on being morally superior from especially the people that I judged the most, the people whose qualities and behaviors I despised the most, right? This process started with me pointing a finger at the person that I felt really hard done by and hurt by. And I was constantly pointing finger at this person and how could they do this, and blaming them, and seeing all the narcissistic qualities and seeing the manipulations and seeing all sorts of things now about them. And at some point, basically, that finger that I was pointing at them turned around and it was now pointing at me. And I was basically forced to see every single quality that I despise in this person in myself. It was like sitting in a sort of cinema and looking at the screen, and every time I pointed to the behavior that I hated or that hurt me, or that I judged in whatever way, immediately there was a memory there was something coming up, there was a situation from the past, or even, doesn't matter whether past a long time ago or recent past, there would be multiple examples of me displaying the same qualities, of me doing the very same things, maybe differently, maybe more subtly, in all kinds of different forms, but nevertheless, I was doing the very same thing. So there was literally nothing there was absolutely nothing that I couldn't find, in myself. And it started from like the seemingly smallest things, like going from being appalled or judging someone for being judgmental, only to realize that I was judgmental all the time. Being appalled by the fact that someone was deceiving me, only to find out that I was deceiving people in the past. Going from being appalled that someone lied to me, only to now find multiple examples of me lying. And it doesn't matter if there were big lies or small lies or white lies or half truths, but there were just countless examples of that were on display for me to remind me. And in the book, I talked about the most excruciating part of the process, which was really just seeing my manipulative behaviors that were so subtle. They didn't look anything like manipulations. In fact, they were so nicely covered up in something else, so well disguised that there was no way, they were so unconscious, I wouldn't be able to see it. One of the things that I would be appalled if you ever accused me of would be that I'm a manipulative person, because in my mind, manipulative person was someone who was whose intention was to manipulate people consciously. And so because I couldn't identify a moment at which I would manipulate someone on purpose, therefore I assumed that I wasn't manipulative. But the manipulations that I saw, the manipulative behaviors that I saw, were just so subtle, like I said, that there was just no way. And they were now coming up to light. This was hell. From the point of identity that thrives on feeling special, noble, better than the people it judges, this was hell. This was hell, because identity was thriving on this idea that I was better than the person I despised, that I was better, morally superior, different. What was incredible about this process was that I remember desperately looking for just one thing, something that I could hold on to and say, I've never done that, but I've never done that, but I could never be this. And then something else would come up to prove me otherwise. So it was almost like some kind of bullshit detector was on, and it was so relentless that I just couldn't find anything that would make me ultimately different from anyone else. And that was devastating. It was devastating, because the reason why it felt like hell, because all of a sudden, if I take the one person that I was so judgmental of and I was accusing for hurting me, I felt so much better than this person. I felt so above them, and feeding this story that I could never act or that the way they did, or that I didn't have those kinds of qualities, only to discover that wasn't true. So the fact that there was now no difference between me and that person was absolutely devastating. So this whole story of seeing myself as special, noble, righteous, morally superior, whatever, all of that just was burning to the ground, bit by bit. And of course, with those revelations, with those truths coming up now and being illuminated about myself, so much shame. And it's sitting through that shame that was so excruciating, sitting through shame, sitting through guilt, and then sitting through the pain of realization that I was no better. Yeah, there's just no way to describe what that felt like other than using words like hell and devastating. And it was viscerally devastating. It wasn't just perceptually devastating. It was viscerally devastating. It literally made me almost like physically sick. Very often during this process, I literally felt physically sick. So from my perspective, I really cannot imagine at least my awakening process without descending into that hell. I really just don't. Because even though it was absolutely excruciating to see the truths, albeit incredibly uncomfortable about myself, was way more liberating than continuing to live a lie, than continuing to the pretense, basically. And so my first death, quote unquote, came, I think, few months after this process. And what was important about that, this sort of timing, was that sitting through that darkest night was also really expanding my capacity to be in the body with everything that I was experiencing, to be sitting in my body with a lot of fear, with a lot of shame, with a lot of guilt, without trying to escape it, without trying to numb it, without distracting myself from it. And so there came a point where, after I think a few months, things have settled, and then this massive existential wave of terror kind of came out of nowhere, and it was so powerful. But at that point, as terrifying as it was, there was a readiness to go with the wave rather than against it, if that makes sense. It didn't actually feel like there was a choice at this point. There was a momentum. There was just something that was helping me come face to face with that existential fear. And that existential fear that I'm talking about was really just basically the fear of not being special. I thought that all that sense of specialness was burned to the ground during the darkest night, but actually that wasn't the case. A lot of it, I would say most of it, was burned to the ground, but then there was a residue of it, but it was palpable. It was still, it may have been a residue, but it was powerful. And I had no idea until that point how the sense of specialness is linked to identity, because meeting that existential fear was meeting the thought that I was not special, because if I wasn't special, then I was nobody. And so the being nobody was the fear, brought about the fear of basically non-existence. Because the nobodiness that I'm talking about, I don't mean, oh, I'm nobody, as in like a new identity. I'm nobody, I'm nothing special. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the nobodiness that says, I don't exist. I don't exist. And so when that was met, it really felt like I died. And two things happened simultaneously. The sense of separation, the pain of separation, the kind of feeling of this deepest aloneness, like even God had abandoned me. That dissolved into this, like the dark void dissolved into what I can only call emptiness or empty fullness. And this was the end of separation on a very visceral level. And there was also the awakening of the gut, really at the same time, where the kind of knot in the solar plexus that was there dissolved. So the sort of existential angst, existential fear basically dissolved together with that knot dissolving, as if that knot was where that fear was held the most. So I refer to this particular shift as like dying before dying, because that's really what that felt like. But there were two other kinds of deaths, two kinds of experiences that felt very different to the one that I've just talked about. The other one came a few months later when this whole idea of me and my life were gone. It's what I call when the I died, because the actual I as a thing. Because even though the first experience felt like dying, the I was still there. It's just emptiness, or the empty fullness were still a kind of a landing place. There was still some kind of an I that died into something else, basically. And that empty fullness became this like a safety net almost, filled with this unconditional love where everything was welcome. And this whole idea of having to get rid of ego or whatever, all of that was just, it just made no sense anymore, because everything was so fully welcome in this empty fullness by this unconditional love. But then there was still the I that didn't now feel separate from God, didn't feel separate from anything. So this was like my first death. So what I refer to as the second death came a few months later. And it was a completely different experience. But I would say this is where the idea of just I and my life completely dissolved. And what also dissolved was this idea of this separate me who was the doer. It was the end of any kind of sense of personal volition. And that was also an incredibly pivotal point in this journey. So in the context of death and dying, I would say that the third kind of a death happened. It's virtually impossible to describe that bit, but I was something that I can't and I will never have words for, to be honest, other than what made it different was that there was simply no sense of I left anymore. Before, there was always some kind of sense of I left, the I that was experiencing something, the I that was something, that was still first and foremost looking for some kind of place to land. The mind can hijack any profound shift and basically recreate another sense of I, another identity around it. I don't know, I am awareness, I am boundless space, I am nothingness. Literally fill the blanks, whatever fills the blanks is just gone. And not only that, even the I am is there's still an I there. Even an I is still an I. So that goes basically, which is why in the context of death, we can call it that. It's where the distinction collapses. It's the end of it's the end of I that looks for some kind of place to land. It's the end of I that looks for some kind of safety to resolidate itself. It's the end of distinction between the formless and the form, the illusory or real, which is why it's so different from the previous experiences. And that cannot even be described as an experience or a shift. It just cannot be described. It was also a kind of death of the whole story of awakening, of I awakening, arriving anywhere, attaining anything. But again, it doesn't mean that we cannot talk about awakening, that we cannot use pronouns, or all this becomes like a non-issue. It is non-issue. There's just living, there's just being human, and there's just doing what I've always done. But it doesn't mean we cannot talk about awakening. It doesn't mean that we cannot talk about this process. It doesn't mean that it appears like we're going through all sorts of stages and stuff. Like there's no need to either hold on to anything or deny anything. It's just like we can just chill and just talk like normal humans. So this has been my experience, and I completely understand why this is not really often talked about, because when we have this idea of awakening just being this like bliss, transcendence, and all the nice things, those were really very blissless parts of the journey, but they were incredibly important. I really can't imagine this process without any of those deaths that I talked about. And really, from the point of identity, that is very scary. It's completely normal that not wanting to face the void, not wanting to face the existential fear, it's completely normal. It's completely understandable. But what I also have found, not just in my experience, but the experience of other people, is that there comes a point where it's time. There's some kind of a mysterious timing to it. There comes a point where there's just readiness, and it doesn't matter how afraid we are of it or not. It's it becomes a sort of a happening, and there's not much really choice involved when this happens, but there's definitely a readiness, even though there may be still fear. So there's nothing to speed up here or to push or prevent. There really is just letting things be exactly as they are, and trusting that process, that when those moments come, if they do come, there will be readiness for them. And we don't need to anticipate it. We don't need to think about it if we're not there. We just really don't. But there will be readiness. There will be readiness. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to share with you today. Thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed it, please remember to like the video and to subscribe. And I'll talk to you soon.